By the 9 and 4, welcome to the library. I am the recorder, and today we will be exploring the vanguards of the realm's efforts to rediscover and connect to all the local clusters' still lost systems, nebulas, and other cosmological features. The Expedious Fleet, that mighty collection of vessels, which are in some cases larger than the objects of their search and discovery. As regular visitors and my perceptive patrons are aware, but for new guests of the library, this shall be but a brief introduction to these immense vessels and who commands them. Further entries on topics of interest such as individual vessels or their notable crew will be forthcoming as time and expressed interest allow. So, as always, please don't hesitate to make your voice heard. The history of the Expedious Fleet is extremely long and confusing, if not downright convoluted. This is due to the effects of the home realm vanishing, when the daemon Vanson was summoned and the reign began. A result of which was that time became inconsistent in the rest of the Credelis cluster. Only systems and vessels in regular and steady contact with each other seemed to be able to maintain any sort of relativity in both time and space to each other. As the skies grew ever darker, with other systems fading from view as they desynced from one another. The scales of time and the rate of its passage was thus left wild and adrift, until the Age of Valor, when the home world returned to the cluster. However, for our purposes today, this does not matter overly much, as the exact timing of events are not as important as they might otherwise be. This is because the amount of time covered in this period, tens of thousands if not more years, passed for each of the different vessels in a different way. Therefore, it makes this period far better and easier looked at for the collection of events that happened within each vessel's period than to try to arrange the events along a singular collection of a timeline, as the very scales of the line would be not compatible between vessels, colonies, and other disconnected populaces. To recap, after the creation of the first 4 of the Expedious Fleet vessels, discussed in a much earlier entry, the exploration and propagation of the peoples of Jam'mar was mostly disconnected from many of the events ongoing on the homeworld. Many of the fleet were in shock, in fact, as news eventually reached them that war between the elders was ongoing. And, for a time, the fleet was awash in rumor and worry about that conflict spreading beyond Jam'mar herself. Approximately by the time of the Second War of Feather and Scale, and at its end with Jam'mar blinking out of reality, the fleet had continued its mission to explore and found new colonies, now hoping to lay the seeds for Jam'mar's continued existence. It had been noted that temporal dilations had begun to form between different systems and even vessels of the fleet, even in the earliest days of traveling from the homeworld, but never at the scale seen after the loss of Jam'mar, where before a fraction of a second difference between vessels traveling vast distances away from each other over years could be detected. Hours and minutes became commonplace, followed soon by days, weeks, months, and eventually centuries. Further complicating matters was the total and sudden severing of all Christech, magical, and technological links between the fleet, as well as most of the colonies, and the homeworld. Only in-system links seemed to have survived what had happened. Beyond that, each and every ship, system, and colony was now on their own. And this is where we find the origins of the ancient empire under the Scriptorum's leadership, sometime during this period. The ships of the fleet were scattered and now out of touch with each other. The Primus, the flagship of the fleet then as it is now, was slowly failing due to being massively understaffed, as the events prior to the loss of the homeworld had seen vast numbers of personnel leaving the ship due to matters of family, nation, or other duties or honor-bound actions. The Celestial, the Analar's vessel, seems to have entered or perhaps been ensnared by a series of gravitational singularities which had become the subject of their study and research for what appears to be nearly the entirety of Jam'mR's absence. The Draxus, the draconic warship of the fleet, was mostly emptied and abandoned, as conflicts erupting on board after the loss of the homeworld between various factions drove most on board to find a world, any world, to settle on just to avoid the devastation. The Draxus would eventually be recovered by the Scriptorum and copied to make the 9 main, yet smaller vessels of the current Ancient Empire's fleet, each an Expedious-class vessel, and with the Draxus at its head. The Minoris, the vessel of the flame-forged humans, ran on automatic systems, as those living on board continued the traditions and lives they had always had. And in fact, they were just going to be another colony, just a mobile one. Until the Age of Stars, this is about all we know about the fleet in the time between the reign of Anson until the Age of Stars. The Age of Stars truly begins with the discovery and reclamation of the Expedious Primus by Killian and Emma Skychild, as well as their compatriots. And while not being the first interstellar adventure the realms had embarked in since the defeat of Anson, it was when the first indications of any sort of Jam'mR-based expansion previous to the Wars of Feather and Scale was discovered and acknowledged widely. The Teltechians had only been reunified with Jam'mR a mere centuries earlier, and the Ego Nebula was still undergoing the lengthy processes of being cataloged and explored by Ego Corps. It is with the recovery and restoration of the Primus that some of the details about what happened in all those years beyond Jam'mR's memory made it clear that there had been hundreds, if not more, worlds, moons, and other places colonized before everything went wrong. In the roughly 1,000 years after its reclamation, and before the conflict with the Ancient Empire and their Scriptorum masters, Jam'mR moved with care from system to system, carefully exploring and searching for their lost kin amongst the stars. Unfortunately, with only the rarest of exceptions, most worlds discovered with any evidence of civilization was only that of long dead and abandoned ruins, some being dated to ages beyond the calendar as was understood at the time. This is when the time dilation, be it became a confirmed and understood fact, as opposed to merely conjecture. The fleet also would see the return of both the Celestial and the Minoris fairly early in this time, with the leader of both peoples, Lord Protector Nikamar of the Analar, and God Emperor Price of the Flameforge, respectively, seemingly retrieving their vessels using long sealed-away records and tools expressly designed for this purpose. So far as could be determined at the time, the Draxus had gone beyond the reach of any who might have had access to any such tools, if they had ever existed in the first place. However, with 3 of the original vessels recovered, the now growing realms of Jam'mar was able to spread at a vastly increased pace, with each of the Expedious ships acting as a hub for exploration and research. At the point at which contact, and soon after war, was made with the ancient empire, the realms had dozens of fledgling and a few established colonies across the small area they had so far explored. During the various actions of the war with the Empire, 3 more Expedious ships were crafted and put into service. This serves as near undeniable truth of the degree of concern expressed by the Divine, as it is only with the aid of the Divine themselves that such ships of massive resource investment and generally time required for construction could ever have been put into service so quickly. The Teltekians' endeavor was the first. With the Enlightened, the vessel of the Rodkin, Goblin, and Scaleblast coming shortly within a year of the endeavors. And finally, the Sentinels, a vessel built by the crafted races of the Analar, the Crestons, Dragwa, Celestians, and Draysai. This was in direct response to the discovery that the Draxus was indeed intact and was serving as the flagship of this ancient empire's own fleet. And even with these additional ships, the Empire's fleet outnumbered the fleet of the realms, 10 to 6. Worries were high about the effects and degree of devastation that would result if any of these massive vessels ever engaged in direct conflict with each other. Fortunately for all, it appears that both sides also feared the possible loss of such resources. So, for the bulk of the conflict, these mighty ships danced around one another to deny passage or otherwise serve as the core of fleet command for a region. With the ending of the war, and the admission of the Empire as a sovereign entity to Kaisa, the Draxus was turned over to the command of the realms, as was the right for the realms to construct up to 2 more of these massive vessels to bring them to parity with the Empire's 9 vessels now of Expedious classification. While not revealed or perhaps even built yet, if some of the rumors are to be believed, it is heavily speculated that at least one of these craft will be for the elves, dwarves, gnomes, and halflings, those cultures and peoples of the younger races that are seemingly unrepresented within the fleet. In fact, some say that this craft has been in the works or design stages since before any of the newer additions to the fleet, and merely awaits the right time for final construction, assembly, and deployment. Whatever the case may be, The rising tensions would seem to be the perfect cause to put into effect any such plans or designs. There is nothing known about the 9th and final ship that could be built as part of the fleet, or if it has even been contemplated, as the cost and efforts and resources required to create one of these massive ships is enormous. It is thought the ancient empire mined entire worlds, if not systems, to their core, building their fleet. However, the Realms is not prepared to be so destructive in the efforts to construct and maintain its vessels. Command of these mighty ships rests with those either appointed or who have staked their claim and not having it had been successfully challenged. The Primus has Killian Skychild as her captain, the Celestial, led by Nikamar, while the Minoris has ever known Price as her top commander as God Emperor. The Endeavor is led, just like the Teltechians themselves, by Jacob the Omnicog, while the trio Sitsamad, Meekin, and Ao command the Enlightened. And, as a choice made in full recognition of the irony of it, the Sentinence is captained by the head of the Analar House Olon, Raz Olon to be specific. Command of the Draxus, after her return by the ancient empire, originally sat with Lord Starwalker, a Praetor Dragon Knight in service to none other than Naiwi, one of the firsts of dragonkind. However, in more recent times, the firstborn worm Stel, a dragon of star metal scales, and amongst the most ardent campaigners for proper draconic control of the ship, has been seen to appear before the Expedious Fleet Conclave in the role of Captain of the Draxus. What transpired for this change to occur is unknown, but appears to have been an amicable event, as the power represented by either party all but guarantees that a fight between them could not go unnoticed, much less unspoken of, even in only hushed rumor. Speaking of the Expedious Fleet Conclave, it is a body that serves to keep communication and cohesion between the various interests of the ships of the fleet and their allies. Beyond the function of information distribution and logistical organization and planning between the Expedious Fleet elements, it also concerns itself with the final two bodies that make up the modern Expedious Fleet: the Pathbreakers and the E.D.F, or Expedious Defense Fleet. The Pathbreakers have been the subject of a previous entry, but in short, it is an all-Praetor formation that serves as scouts and assessors of new worlds, systems, and other stellar features. The E.D.F, on the other hand, is a mixed species force comprised of all races and nations of the realms, with the Empire refraining from participation as is their right under their treaty. However, the vast majority of ships in the E.D.F are Praetor exclusive, with the far numerically less yet larger command and cruiser class vessels being where the bulk of non-Praetors will see their duties take them. This is not for any reason beyond simple efficiency, as the specialized technologies that allow Praetors to operate Pathbreaker vessels that should otherwise take several times the amount of crew are also put to use in these smaller E.D.F vessels. So, ships that might typically require 50 to 100 crew otherwise can be fully operated and maintained by as few as 5 Praetors, with, on average, an actual improvement in overall performance. These technologies are in many ways just incompatible with those of other species, and this is due to very large part to the highly over-engineered of the Praetor's biology themselves. However, this allows the E.D.F. to have vast collections of these smaller and cheaper ships available for the security and close-range support of each vessel of the Expedious Fleet. Most often, these duties include search and rescue in and around these massive vessels, as accidents and collision happen with some frequency. The E.D.F. has a fleet division for each of the vessels of the Expedious Fleet, consisting of at least one flagship class vessel and accompanying vessels of smaller tonnage, with wings of smaller ships serving as the primary active parts of the E.D.F. outside of emergency or war. General command of all E.D.F. divisions and representative to the Conclave is currently held by Horace Skychild, Killian's granduncle. His shrewd manner and charismatic nature have made him a favorite of Conclave watchers, and the apple of the eye of many of the aides or staff and other assistants that work in the halls of the Conclave. His duties thus far, beyond keeping the direct proximity around each of the fleet and all traffic therein safe and moving smoothly, has been coordinating with local fleets and hunter vessels on matters of anti-piracy and shipping lane protection. However, with rising tensions, it is more than likely the E.D.F. will have to serve as the last force that will be deployed before direct Expedious Ship class engagement. This is a concern not only for the E.D.F., but for the wider realms, as the E.D.F. is actively the largest assembly of military force beyond that of the Expedious Fleet itself. And if the E.D.F. cannot prevent direct combat between these massive ships from occurring, what short of an intervention by a great number of the Divine, and the calamity that would entail, could? Each of the Expedious Fleet is a unique vessel. From the 10,000-mile-long Primus with her half-pyramid shape and massive 9 domes, to the jellyfish appearance of the Celestial, with its center 5,000-mile-wide spherical core and 9 trailing extensions of over 2,000 miles in length, to the similarly spherical Endeavor at 5,000 miles in width might lack the extensions of the Celestial. But, as it is the vessel of a people for whom most vehicles and larger mechanical objects are capable of assuming multiple configurations, it is rumored that more than meets the eye is at play under its moon-like appearance. The plant-like form of the biomechanical enlightened looks as if it is a fruit-bearing blossom, with 4 long vine-like extensions of its own trailing along the body of the vessel, itself 5,000 miles long in length. This vessel is contrasted by the very mechanical industrial look of the Sentinels, looking far more like a massive space station than a ship, with its 4 large rings covering 5,000 miles across, and the many pylons and spires that extend from various points along each ring. The Minoris looks like a 4-armed, 5,000-mile tall tower falling through space, while the Draxus is a 7,500-mile long wedge-shaped warship with little room on its hull not taken up by weapon batteries or landing bay entrances, if not defensive systems. The only constant between the vessels of the Expedious Fleet is that each has an orbiting moon, roughly 300 to 400 miles in diameter, each of which serve as the dispersed yet connected homeland of the Praetors. These moons are heavily influenced culturally and in demeanor by the ship they orbit. with a pilgrimage to all 7 required before a praetor can seek to go out amongst the peoples of the realms unsupervised. Whether there are moons prepared for the last 2 ships of the fleet is unknown. However, it would not be a shock if such affairs were dealt with long ago. From the fleet to its moons, and its protectors and scouts, the combined abilities of the Expedious Fleet is matched only by the enormity of its tasks. To expand the light of the realms, while serving as the core of any military planning or logistical chains that would have to be organized within times of calamity or war. While the current Kaisa Grand Council is held on the premise, recent objections to the center of all realms governance being held on what is ostensibly the flagship of Jam'mar's interstellar forces, have pointed out the need for a neutral structure to be constructed and utilized to prevent any accusations of bias or indeed danger coming to the Council if conflict involving the premise were to occur. This highlights once more the multifarious nature of the politics and games being played by those at these heights of power. And this is where I shall bring this entry to a close. I hope you have a better understanding of the Expedious Fleet, its function, and a bit about the ships that comprise it and protect them, as well as granting insight as to the delicate way in which they operate to both expand and reunite the realms, as well as keeping an ever-vigilant eye to those threats that may come from within or without. My perceptive patrons, regular visitors, and of course, new guests of the library, I, as always, have been the recorder, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart for your time, interest, and continued support of and in the Realms of Jam'mR. Now, until you next visit the library for another entry, by the 9 and 4, be well, take care of yourselves and each other. If you'd like to contribute to the further exploration and explanation of the realms, please consider leaving a comment, a like, and sharing the video around. I read all the comments and make efforts to reply to each. Thank you for helping to grow the channel, and know I look forward to each and every one of your comments. Other methods of support can be found in the channel's description. Thank you for watching,